I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about orangutans.
My friends, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Tell us how they accompanied you in this journey. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast. About 2 billion hectares across the world are covered by tropical forests. These are incredibly vibrant regions that are teeming with life. They harbor about 50 to 80% of the known animal and plant species. They can be the source for clean air, clean water, food, energy, economic livelihoods, all while providing critical carbon sinks to help absorb greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, all too often, economic progress has come at the expense of our forests. We've already lost about one third of the world's forests, and we're still losing about 10 million hectares a year, primarily because of agriculture, including things like beef, soy, and palm oil. There have been long term efforts to slow deforestation and even reverse it through reforestation. But these efforts can be difficult, especially when they require trade offs with the economic activities that local communities rely on.
So we did go to Indonesia, set up a big training facility, trained 1,150 foresters, set up some 740 nurseries, planted hundreds of millions of trees with the new technologies that I developed. Wrote lots of publications with supervising many, many students. And then until I fell in love with orangutans, so then I set up what's now the world's largest private conservation organization, Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation.
This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Willie Smits, who takes a very different approach to reforestation.
But I also realized that growing trees alone was not enough. And if I wanted to save the orangutans, I needed to save the forests. So that way became the basis of setting up the Masarang Foundation, which has its goal to preserve nature through the empowerment of local people. And that meant creating value from that forest and bring back biodiversity. So all the triple P things, people, profit, planet, had to be in that circle and do it on a scientific basis. So that's what I've been doing for the last 46 years.
Willie is a social entrepreneur and an Ashoka Fellow, which is where we met each other over a decade ago while I was at Ashoka. Willie is also the founder of the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation and the Masarang Foundation. He launched a television channel in North Sulawesi, a province in Indonesia. In economic architecture terms, Willie introduced a structural innovation. He's not asking local community members, governments, or businesses to look out for the well being of the forest at the expense of their own interests. Instead, he's changing the strategic landscape so that community members have a vested economic interest in restoring the forest. Willie has innovated approaches to forest preservation and reforestation through his detailed scientific discoveries, which you'll hear in our conversation. Ultimately, it's helping to make a stronger habitat for his beloved orangutans and so much more. You've been doing this for decades and you've been a kind of a source of constancy kind of in focusing on and driving this forward. And you've already succeeded at a very large scale, and still we have so much further to go.
Yes.
Take us back to kind of the beginning, the inspiration for this. What really prompted you to focus on this topic?
On reforestation. Yeah, in 1980, I was in the jungle of Kalimantan and I brought back some seeds to the greenhouse at the university in the Netherlands and germinated those. And then they stopped growing, turned yellow. I tried everything and nothing worked. No light conditions, temperature, humidity, whatever. And then I did some tissue culture work and found out that they needed vitamin B complex. Very strange. So I thought they missed something, looked in literature, found something very, very old, and it said mycorrhizae, fungi that live in symbiosis with the roots. Tried 60 different species from the Netherlands, nothing worked. I sent a student to the tree from where I had collected the seed to get a soil sample. He brought it back. I put it in with the seedlings and bang, they grow. And then there was a visit by a professor from Indonesia, and he said, "Wow, you made these plants grow. We've been trying that for 100 years." He went away. A week later, we got another visitor. It turned out to be the advisor to the minister. And a week later, I got an invitation from the Minister of Forestry, Dr. Smits, come over to Indonesia and put into practice what you have discovered in the greenhouse. And that was the start of 46 years working here in Indonesia in the tropical forest. So we did go to Indonesia, set up a big training facility, trained 1,150 foresters, set up some 740 nurseries, planted hundreds of millions of trees with the new technologies that I developed. Wrote lots of publications with supervising many, many students, and then until I fell in love with orangutans. So then I set up what's now the world's largest primate conservation organization, the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation. But I also realized that growing trees alone was not enough, and if I wanted to save the orangutans, I needed to save the forests. So that way became the basis of setting up the Masarang Foundation, which has its goal to preserve nature through the empowerment of local people. And that meant creating value from that forest and bring back biodiversity. So all the triple P things, people, profit, planet, had to be in that circle and do it on a scientific basis. So that's what I've been doing for the last 46 years. So now I'm a head of a small university, and I'm also the principal advisor to the Minister of Forestry. So quite involved in a 2 million hectare agroforestry program, including sugar palms for water, energy, and food security, and doing that on degraded lands in Indonesia. And I still manage some other foundations.
It's been an incredible trajectory. I think it's hard for people to appreciate the scale of your work. I don't think people really appreciate or are aware of just how bad the deforestation was and why reforestation was so important.
So the reasons for the deforestation were, of course, they started off with the logging, but also for later oil palm. We are the biggest oil palm producer in the world, about 20 million hectares of those oil palms, just monocultures, no biodiversity, using lots of fertilizer. You have the rubber tree plantations, then you have the slash and burn agriculture. When the population increases and the people have no money to buy fertilizer, then they go to the most simple technique. They cut the trees, they burn them, and the ash becomes a temporary fertilizer that they can grow for a year some crops, and then they move on to the next piece of forest to be cut down and come back after a number of years. But that number of years is getting too short for the soil to completely recover, and then they end up as those degraded lands in the end with grasslands that are just biological deserts, no sound, and there's this yellow grass and scorched earth. And yeah, to rehabilitate that takes a lot of effort because you have to do it the natural way and to eradicate that grass. And it's really difficult because it has these deep roots in the soil that are the only ones that survive, from which after a fire the sprouts can come up and start all over again until the next fire. So to suppress that grass, you have to shade them out and you have to compete with it. So you have to help the tree species that can actually survive in those conditions for so long that they can shade out the grass, and then you can restore the whole system. So what we saw in Samboja Lestari in East Kalimantan, where we did this on a 1,856 hectare plot of pure grassland, and within just 8 years, we have now back from 0 species of birds, 163 species of birds. We planted 1,243 different tree species, which is more than all the tree species you have in the United States and in such a small area. Not all of those have survived, but we still have almost 500 different tree species that have survived this selection process, natural selection. And it's now a system that harbors enormous amounts of biodiversity for flora and fauna. So we see now butterflies, we see now salamanders and frogs coming back that people have never thought would actually be occurring in that area. Many species of primates living there, and at the same time created lots of jobs in the reforestation for the orangutan project that I set up in that 1,856 hectare area to where the orangutans can be trained and live on islands where they can, if for those that cannot be returned back to the wild. So it is actually possible if you work with nature to speed up that process of natural degeneration. But you have to stop fires. You have to work with the local people. It takes a lot of education, but you need to get them jobs. You make it important for the people themselves. And the people are appreciating it because the temperature has gone down 5 degrees Celsius around there. The rainfall has gone up 30%. And you see that the growth of the crops of the people are living in that area is now much better. People now dare to build houses along the rivers that do no longer flood, and they are no longer afraid of the fires. So it has helped people and nature to come back in this combination.
I mean, it's truly remarkable that this is an example of how thoughtful, consistent, sustained kind of interaction can create massively beneficial impacts on the climate, on the environment, on people's lives, and also increasing economic activity. And I think,
Yes,
yeah, I think it's a wonderful example of that because I think all too often people accept the idea that these things are always in trade-offs and always in tension. And there are times when trade-offs are important, but if we're thoughtful about this and we think about how do we deal with our natural systems, our natural environmental pieces, along with how it genuinely works for the people who are close by, and as you say, how do we help create a vested interest for them in the success of our natural systems? We can actually create things that create benefits in all three different categories, which is really remarkable.
indeed. We have a lot of degraded lands in Indonesia at the moment. We are working on 12.7 million hectares of severely degraded lands that need to be reforested through agroforestry. We have millions of hectares of grasslands that become like a permanent vegetation type because they burn several times a year and kill off all the microbial life in the topsoil. And it's really hard to make those soils that flush out all the nutrients to bring back fertility there and make them grow. So you need trees to bring up the nutrients from deeper layers to the branches, the leaves, and they become litter and they fall on the top of the soil and they start enriching the soil. So the trees become like the nutrient pumps. And you need to select the right type of trees that have associations with certain bacteria that fix nitrogen from the air so you don't need the artificial fertilizer. You restore the microclimate that enables the long living species to survive in that shade first and to gradually take over in the way that nature does it. When you have a gap, you have these pioneer species like wheat species, and then when they start dying off, the original forestry species take over again. So those are the systems that I'm also building in, but with species selected to serve the local purposes. So they are adjusted to the local topography, the soil types, the local climate, the biome, the zone of certain ecological species diversity. And we also then look at next what are the main criteria, what is needed by local people, food security, or is it income? And then we're looking at carbon, how much sequestration does take place? Is water regulation more important? We look at the logistics, what markets are nearby, what products can be marketed, and all of those things go into a kind of fuzzy logic model to find out the different options and which ones will work best under the given conditions for any place in those degraded lands.
Can I play that back to you for someone who's less familiar with the details of your work to see if I'm tracking well, and you can correct me as a tremendous amount of landscape that was deforested in part for timber and other purposes, and now we have these kind of grasslands that emitting tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases.
No more, but they have. They are now biological deserts and they have very low amount of carbon stored in those systems. So regenerating them is actually creating a drawdown system where you then can sequester capture the CO2 from the air through photosynthesis, and those
Right.
carbohydrates then become the biomass for the trees and for the organic matter in the soil. In that way, you restore it. In
Um,
addition, I need to mention one other subject, which is called biochar. The terra preta from South America, the dark soils that store so much carbon. You actually can use this super material as a startup accelerator for these new forests. And by doing that, you're actually storing for thousands of years the CO2 that was captured by the plants and now in the form of biochar is improving the soil and the above ground production. So you need less fertilizer, you have better, healthy, more nutrient rich products for the people, you have better climatic, microclimatic conditions, everything is improving in this combination. So that's quite an spectacular development over the last few years. And we have now all these carbon credit schemes, and they are valuing the biochar now what it is really worth for. So it has very high prices. So now this becomes interesting for almost anyone to do this kind of restorative approaches for nature.
That's remarkable. For folks who are less familiar, who may not have been to Indonesia, you talk about the people who are nearby and needing to create so that they have a vested interest in the success of the forest. Who can you help paint the picture? Who's living there? How many people? Can you help us see what you're seeing through your eyes?
Indonesia is an archipelago of 70,500 islands with some 700 languages, and the people are as different from region to region. So, if we are working in Java, all we need to do is speak to the Sultan, the king, the man who connects to the goddess of the sea. And when he says this is something good to do, then the people will do it. And that's actually how we are working with him in certain areas of Java Island. But if you go to the Dayaks, they have this democratic society. So for anything to work, they sit together, drink, and talk and discuss for 3 days. And then if there is a general agreement, then they go for it. Or you have the Minangkabau, where you can only do things through the women who are the matriarchal society. So it really depends where you go. Important to learn the local languages, learn the local traditions, what makes them tick, and you have to combine that know-how with the local ecological conditions and the marketing possibilities in order to make it a successful working program. You have to have respect for them, so it has to be really preserving nature through the empowerment of local people. The green belt of the world. Indonesia is, of course, very fortunate to be located on the equator where we have enough land, where we have the right temperature, where we have the right amount of rainfall and the year-round sunshine. We don't have these months without leaves on the trees and no productivity of the land. So if you want to really save the world and create energy from the sun through this biomass, and food security, then you have to do it in the tropics. So this whole tropical belt from India, but also almost still the Mediterranean climate zones can make a very good use of the systems that we are developing here.
Yeah, absolutely, and it becomes all the more necessary as we're seeing climate change and some of these severe extreme weather uh, occurrences are increasing, and here it also helps make communities more resilient in the face of these. It's remarkable. And what kind of economic benefits are the local people who are participating with you seeing as a result?
For example, in the reforestation schemes in Kalimantan, the people first of all get jobs in the nursery, in the planting, in the maintenance of the trees, but also in the harvesting of certain resins. They can also collect honey from that forest. In between the trees, they can grow medicinal plants or gingers and tubers that can grow in the shade underneath those trees. They can grow also vanilla on the stems that need the shade of that light condition in the new forest there. They also will be able to sell meat because they can have goats that can eat the pruned branches from the trees that you want to grow straight. And when they eat the bark and the leaves, the fertilizer of the goats is mixed with the biochar, goes into the soil and helps them to grow their own crops on their own pieces of land. But they also will get the milk from the goats. They will also have the meat. And that's the same thing with the chickens and the eggs that they can have also, where the chickens are the ones that make the soil aerated so that it becomes loose and it drains water better and the growth of the trees is better. And you get the meat because they live from the insects in all the soil and the worms. For certain species of trees, they can distill oil or sugar palms that are an important component in our program. They produce 65 different products. The people can use the fibers, they can use the wood, but it also provides food security. But the most important thing is you can tap them on a daily basis. And the sugar palm is only one of very few tree species in the world that grow, produce a big crown with leaves, and then they stop growing. And then one by one, these flower stems come out of the tree stem, lower and lower. And for 12 years, you can every day tap from those flower stems, there where you slice 1 millimeter every day, and you can go on tapping and you tap several dozens of liters of sap of about 12 to 15% sugar content. So if you have a sugar palm, one tree can produce enough fuel for one car to drive every day. So it gets also the juice, you can ferment it and then distill the ethanol. So you have all those products that become downstream products for like brooms and carvings and wooden tools. And you still have all these other forest conditions for the wildlife in the same place. So there are dozens and dozens of opportunities for local people to permanently benefit in all stages of that reforestation program, from the very initial phase of the planting up to the fully grown forest that continues to produce all these different products on a continuous basis for the people.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about orangutans.
My friends, yeah.
Yeah.
So
You
yeah, we have.
tell us how they accompanied you in this journey.
Well, yeah, I came across this dying orangutan baby on the market in Balikpapan in East Kalimantan, and that changed my life. And well, the story can be found on the internet. Until today, this year, it's 35 years ago that with the help of school children in Balikpapan, just primary school children, and from their pocket money that they financed the first 3.5 years of what has now grown out to a big organization, 460 staff, and already worked with 5,000 orangutans over these years and released some thousand orangutans back to the wild and established some new populations. And now I'm actually taking on a new project, a risky one, and that's called the Island of the Giants, because there are many of these male orangutans with cheek pads that have become unreleasable. And the zoos in the world also have a lot of those so-called cheek badders. And you only see one in a group with female orangutans on display in the zoos. Because if you put two dominant males there, they will fight. And it could be leading to very uncomfortable situations for the visitors and the zoos. Instead of them being kept in a small cage behind the scenes, away from the public, costing a lot of money, where they sit and wait 50, 60 years till they die in solitary confinement, why not give them a chance to come back to Indonesia? We put them in a group of only males and then on specially selected islands where they can live out the rest of their lifetime with abundant food supply and with enough space to avoid conflicts, but they also socialize first. So it's a group that of becomes like a group of friends, maybe like a kind of monastery, and then they can live out the rest of their life in better conditions, at least in natural conditions, and with the chance of surviving there under much better and less stressful conditions. So this Island of the Giants project in May, we're gonna bring the first 5 giant orangutans to that island: Benny, Bonnie, Bento, Monkey, and Dodo. So I'm really excited to see those big 5 friends start becoming an example, hopefully, for a better future for many of these zoos that have now orangutans that they can send over to us. But we hope that they will also pay for that, for this pension fund, and that they will also publish about the work on the orangutans in Indonesia itself, so that hopefully this will support more conservation activities in Indonesia while helping the animals and the zoos also raising their own profile through better publicity for the visitors.
That's incredible. And yeah, what an incredible project. We'll be very curious to see how it moves forward. And this kind of friend group of adult male orangutans will be fascinating to
Yeah, I
see.
was wondering how you were going to call this.
um, but also to connect those dots for people is if we have a real interest in seeing orangutans thriving, they need these forests. Um,
Yes.
that people also have the forest can also generate real income for local population and a variety of income. They can start to create a kind of heterogeneous economic activity. So they're not dependent. It's also more resilient. There's a whole variety of pathways that they can be living kind of and working together.
This belongs also to the orangutans because the orangutans are the top seed dispersers in that natural forest. They eat some of those fruits, and the seeds then passing their digestive system germinate better. So they are
Yeah.
distributing them and enhancing the regrowth of the forest and keeping the species diversity in place. And through that, also the value of that forest. That forest will have more biomass with more species, will have much lower risk of catching fire, and will provide many more different smaller amounts of sources of materials that people can use, like the resins, like the oil, like the kind of latex you can tap from certain trees, collecting the fruits from there, the mushrooms, then there's all these other products from the forest that can be harvested. And we have loads and loads of land with forests still left. So there's no need for people to do this high intensity agriculture. We can do agroforestry that can create many times more jobs per hectare than these oil palm plantations. So through the combination of establishing buffer zones around the remaining natural forest where people find abundant jobs and much better income than the natural forest itself, we can actually create a solution for both and reduce the pressure upon the forest and have a kind of what we call negative leakage in terms of carbon emissions because there's less land needed, there's higher biomass in the restored systems.
Well, and I think that as people start to learn more about your work, they start to see a different vision of how these things start to work together, right? And how, if you're thoughtful, you can start to build these different pieces together. What's the response been in Indonesia? How's the government and kind of industry looking at the work that you've been doing?
Well, they have to do it now because I'm sitting right next to the minister. Last night, we spoke also for 4 hours with groups of NGOs, and all the programs are being coordinated. So at the moment, yeah, we have a president that is an animal lover, yeah, but he's also still involved in, yeah, with a lot of other businesses. I guess that's the reality of life. But he is allowing us to really do these natural approaches. Yeah, and we have, for example, very few people to protect those forests and to monitor them. So he has just agreed that we can add 60,000 forest rangers to protect the forests and do education and help people with the reforestation efforts, which are huge decisions that can help very vast areas of forest. He has also now invested in the remote sensing technologies, combining all kinds of satellite technologies with the latest drone systems that he has also for the military, of course. And then we can see with LiDAR all through the canopy. We can start identifying species. We can see how much carbon, and we can see every week if some trees have been cut anywhere in Indonesia. So those transparency systems are going to be helping us to stop illegal activities and encroachment. He has also stopped millions of hectares of oil palm that was established illegally through corruption and through bribing people and taking over forest lands. So there is actually real action now, and I've never been as hopeful as I'm right now in Indonesia. I'm really glad that even in my old age here, I can still do some useful things, and now the moment is there. So carpe diem, pick the day.
That is incredible to hear. And so what's the time frame? Is it 1, 3, 5 years? How do you think about this kind of next chapter? I mean, 60,000 new forest rangers is a massive new population that's going to come online and be able to focus, but they have to be recruited and trained and engaged.
Yes,
And from where we are today to them being actually out in the forest, helping to, one, cut down on some of the legal activity, but also start improving the practices. How long does that take?
my guess is about 3 years.
And can, help diversify and increase economic activity also that's coming from these kind of forests.
That is the intention, yes. So the people will be trained in how to make good use of existing forests without destroying it, how to have non-tillage systems for the land so you don't lose all the organic material and you make the soil richer instead of poorer by repeated, very short-term cycles of crops. They need to know about wildlife. They need to know about poaching. They need to know about how to interact with all those different tribes in all those different languages. They need to be equipped with equipment like directional microphones, and all this needs to be thought through. So, yes, but it can be done. It can be done. I feel very good that this movement will go also to other places and people will see. Follow the money is a famous line that people use. And in this case, yes, it is. It was analyzed, those systems that we did by McKinsey, sponsored by the Norwegian government to do an independent assessment of these agroforestry systems. And they come up with IRRs, internal return of revenue, that are higher than those of oil palms. So that is what's going to be motivating. So once we have those first larger scale forests in an operational model with enough small units of people doing this multi-species approach, then you have a constant stream of many products in sufficient volumes to make it profitable and workable. And once we have that unit size reached, many people will come and want to learn and want to apply it in other places.
Yeah, follow the money, but also follow the people, right? I mean, the people who have been involved here can now they themselves can go and pollinate in other areas and spread the
Yes,
ideas. It's remarkable, and it's also the variety of different geographies that this can be applied. You're talking about South America, also in Africa. You know, the range of places where this can be used and needed and benefit the people. If there are people who are listening to this who are kind of excited by the prospect of what you're the work that you're doing and the vision you're kind of putting forward, what can they do? How can they be helpful? What's useful from your
well,
perspective?
they can definitely support the funds that invest in natural regeneration systems, natural permaculture approaches, agroforestry, biochar. Those are companies that are good to invest in for people themselves. They can also come and volunteer and help with the wildlife rehabilitation efforts that we do. Most welcome, and yeah, contribute in that way also a little bit to funding those projects to allow us to rescue more of the animals. They can support foundations like our Masaran Foundation, which is working with people all over Indonesia, bringing them these new technologies, especially with sugar palms, and help other groups of people and local NGOs in Indonesia where they do the things that they are personally most interested in. Yeah, you do your own little bit at your home, using less energy and recycling and all the regular stuff. You can definitely do a lot more if you invest in these kinds of technologies in Indonesia.
Fantastic. Willie, I thank you so much. It's been great catching up and kind of learning about the latest chapter in your work. It's been incredible to see what you've accomplished over this time. And I really appreciate your taking the time today.
Good talking to you, Stuart.
So there's a couple things that are really remarkable. The extent to which we can address this in a meaningful way at large scale. Where Willie is deeply, deeply grounded is in the biology that's required to do it. So there is certain set of sequencing in order to get certain plants to grow in certain times. Those can lead to other plants to grow and others and others and others. So very rich understanding of how one has to work with the different kind of natural species to get them to grow. You know, you can do this at such a large scale that you actually change weather. So you change rain, you change the moisture levels, and it's such a fundamental change that you go from like having almost zero living animals, right? So not even bugs and things like that, to having like this very rich, fertile space. And it's in a modest period of time. So you're talking 5, 10, 15 years, you measurably change weather patterns. So like to go from a place where there's no rain or these massive deluges to instead having rain on a regular basis. There's going to be 60,000 new forest rangers in Indonesia. And Indonesia is a big country, right? 300 million people. But 60,000 new rangers is a huge change of practices that we're likely to see. And not just in places like Indonesia, but he has recipes for how do you apply this in many different geographies. When you think about a natural system, you have to think about the natural system. You also have to think about the people connected to that system and the economic drivers there, right? So if you're going to change large scales of landscapes, it's going to affect people's lives, their livelihoods, their communities, how they're living, et cetera. And in order for it to be done successfully, one of really kind of key observations that you see throughout his work is that it has to not be merely acceptable or okay with local population. Actually, what you need is for the local population to have a vested interest in the success of this. You go from having like external governments like policing, like non-poaching, all that kind of stuff, no polluting, et cetera, to actually local population needing to have their own economic interests tied up with the thriving of the natural environment that they're around. He always does this in ways that are socially contextual. So Indonesia is a massive archipelago. You need to respect and follow how the different communities make decisions. Some are democratic, some are cooperative, some are hierarchical. Right? You need to understand that and approach them fully with that in mind. And then also you need to help create economic benefit for the local communities from the natural environment. Willie sets up economic activity such that if you're just pursuing economic activity, your own economic interests, the best way to do so is to carry out the behaviors which are best for our natural environments as well. So it's reflective of a kind of central kind of economic architecture principles and approaches there. Innovators are distinctive individuals, right? Like they come with their own personalities. They're driven by the things that resonate with them to create the impact, and they will dive very deep into like whatever rabbit hole they need to get the answers they need to create the impact that they're looking for. His approach works all the way across the tropics belt, is places in the world that we have a massive opportunity. We are under realizing the organic potential across the tropics. And in many places, those areas are turning into deserts or other kinds of things. This is a huge opportunity if you want to think, how do you both create economic activity, improve social well-being, cohesiveness, decrease political turmoil, and improve food and energy production and decrease greenhouse gases. It's a recipe that works for a massive part of our land across the globe. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.